This is the United Podcast Network.
This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Thank you, and welcome to another episode of Voices in Validation, brought to you by the IVT Network. Each week, we bring you timely interviews with industry experts from pharma, biotech, medical devices, and life science manufacturing, with discussions focused on trending topics, frequently asked questions, and industry best practices. This week, we are pleased to welcome two guests. We have Lori Richter and James Vesper here with us. We're going to be talking about adult learning and the impact that certain theories and practices have on corporate learning environments and training programs. So welcome to both you, Lori and Jim. It's great to have you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Yeah, we have so much to cover, I feel like, in this episode. So we're going to dive right in. Well, I mean, it's interesting because, learning is not anything new. We've been doing it for forever and ever. But I feel like grad schools, continuing ed providers, corporate training programs, they're all attempting to impart learning that's both practical, impactful, and effective. And as we've learned over time, each student has distinct needs when they're learning and different ways of learning. So for adults especially, learning can be awkward. They may feel like they're out of practice or out of place. Adult learning theory is gaining in popularity for corporate training and outside corporate training. And Lori, I know you did a fair amount of research on this topic. So can you briefly describe this concept for us to kick us off?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Stacey. So I think one thing that's important to remember about adults is that adults, unlike children, come with a lot of background information. They've already been around the world. They've already kind of seen and have a lot of knowledge and information and their own experiences. Children, on the other hand, typically don't come with all those experiences. We provide them as they grow over time. And so their learning and acceptance is a little bit different than an adult in that sense. I think there's a couple of things I wanted to cover that are really known from Malcolm Knowles' work. And that's what I did a lot of my research with so that I can understand a little bit better about what adults how can we sort of teach them and what are the things that they sort of bring with them, those attributes. And I think one thing that's important is the adult is sort of already aware of their self, right? They've already sort of had their own thought processes. They don't sort of tie themselves to their parents, right, like a child would, and sort of think about what the adults have kind of taught them. They've already sort of built that background and structure from their own experiences. They bring a lot of past experiences with them. So when they walk into your class and you start to tell them something, you kind of have to think about what they've already brought with them, what they've learned themselves, because they're considering that as you're talking to them, right? They're considering whether or not, does this sort of mesh with what I already know? And they're judging you kind of as an instructor as you're talking in that sense.
Right. Right.
They're very purpose-driven in their learning. They've either been told that they need to take this in the pharma environment, maybe it's in their training plan, or they know they need to do it to achieve some sort of goal. The other thing that's unique and different, I think, about adults is they're typically ready and willing. They've signed up for this, right? Whether it's that master's program or what have you. Whereas a child may be sort of told in third grade, you got to go take this, and they sort of drag themselves there, right? That adult is kind of open and willing. They have that internal motivation. So either this course is going to get them somewhere or achieve a goal or a certification that they want to achieve. So that's something that's important to think about. I do this in my trainings too, and I know Jim does as well, is we set them up to make mistakes in a safe environment because that's how they learn best as well. Sure. Whereas with children, we typically go, this is how, and we don't let them necessarily make those mistakes, right? With adults, that's how they best kind of learn. And then lastly, the adult likes to be active in what they're learning, and they don't want to always just be told. They want to be a part of the discussion and maybe even a part of the development of that training course, if you will. Absolutely. So those are kind of some of the concepts.
Absolutely. And I just having been an adult learner myself at times and been involved in creating some different conferences and events where we do impart education, I certainly would agree that a lot of that thinking and mindset for adults is definitely present, and you have to take it into consideration. And we'll dive in, later in the episode, dive into some of those concepts and ideas a little bit more. But what other learning theories and practices are being studied and implemented that have proven effective in adult learning? And should we expect to employ a variety of tactics or choose one model and stick with it? And Jim, I know you have some experience and some research behind you on different theories of adult learning.
Yeah, I think, Lori really encapsulated the ideas of Malcolm Knowles really well. But if you look at where Knowles got some of his ideas, it goes back to some other research. And I think that's really valuable. People come in with certain amounts of knowledge, experience, levels of things that they've done before. Part of that is a social learning theory that, came out of the 1930s. So that has that. People want to be able to create something. That really goes back to the constructivist, constructionist theory that came out in part by Seymour Papert at MIT, where he said, that somebody has learned when they can actually create something, some sort of an artifact. So that's how he was teaching computer programming to kids. If they could come out with a robot that worked and ran across the room, he knew that they had learned something about computer programming. So I think, as we look at some of these other theories, we can really build on that work of Knowles and make it a little bit richer about, how can we involve people? And, maybe somebody in my workshop knows more about microbiology than I do. Well, that's one of the things I always look for when I do training. Who's the microbiologist in the room? Who can answer some of those questions that I don't know? So I think, using some of those other theories can really enrich that learning environment.
That makes total sense. What about the read and understand model that we see often used in standard operating procedure training, right? Because that seems to be counterintuitive to me, but I'll let you guys talk about that.
Where do we begin, Jim? I know. So Jim and I have actually even talked about this, and I consider read and understand sort of the bane of my existence in terms of calling it training even. And we also like to do death by SOP reading for a new hire, right? We assign them, 100 SOPs, and then we not only tell them to read all of them, but read them in a short period of time because we have a metric behind that, right? That we're measuring as well. So my opinion is that reading and understanding something is actually kind of funny in and of itself, because I can't always just read something and understand it without any examples, without any attempts at using something, without any guidance or coaching from someone about what this even is something that is very frustrating to me. And I actually did cover it by paper too, that Stacey, that you saw, that I sort of covered. I think I called it one of the most rudimentary tools in our training toolbox. But that's my feeling about it. It needs to be accompanied with something else to really drive home that reinforcement of what you're trying to learn there. And Jim?
Yeah, I call it not read and understand, but read and hope. You're hoping somebody has actually absorbed that. And, it all depends on what you're trying to accomplish in that training. If you just want someone to know that, hey, this procedure exists, this is when I'm going to use it, okay, that might be useful. But as Laura said, if you want someone actually to do something, it's going to be a lot harder.
Right.
And really that goes back to some work in knowledge management that a guy by the name of Michael Polanyi did in the 1960s. And in one of his books, he said, we know much more than we can say, and we say much more than we can write. So we know more than we can say, we say more than we write. So if you give somebody a procedure, the only thing that they have access to is what's written down on the page.
Yes.
They don't have that chance to ask questions. They don't have the chance to get some of that art in doing that task. So, one
that
of the
makes
other
sense.
things,
And they're missing out on all the knowledge that someone else had, right? Because they've already pared down what they're able to write. So I never thought about it from that perspective, but very intuitive.
Yeah. And just one other thing about that is, you're a new employee, you're reading all these procedures about this process, piece of equipment, a lab instrument, how do I prepare these samples? And you're reading that and you have no picture in your mind of what this looks like.
Sure.
So, if you have to do read and understand, my recommendation is get somebody to see the process first. How do you set up this filling machine? How do you do that gowning before you read and understand? Because now you're going to have a mental model. You're going to have a picture in your mind. So when I read through this procedure, it's like, oh yeah, that's when, she did this, or that's when he put on that. So having that picture in your mind does make it a little bit better, but there's still some big limitations to read and understand.
But that sounds like a great compromise, Jim. If they are going to do that, at least expose them to the process or the procedure ahead of time, so they at least form, some sort of thought process around it. But understanding, listening to the two of you, it sounds like this is definitely the least preferred type of learning, especially in an adult learning environment. And as you both mentioned, there's key assumptions that surround every adult learner, outlining general ways in which adults perceive learning, how they feel about it, what they bring to it. And given the various models and methods, why does this count so much in creating and delivering instruction for the adult learner? Lori, I'll let you kick that off.
Yeah, I think it's important that we consider those things that we mentioned already in our discussion, because if we don't, that adult learner actually has the capability to sort of shut us off as an instructor and not absorb that information. Especially one of the things that when I mentioned we have to take into account their previous learnings is they will challenge you, which is actually not a bad thing when you're an instructor. I kind of enjoy that dialogue. And Jim and I probably both are the same. We feed off of the energy of the class. And if you're talking, at least I know you're listening, right? And we're discussing. But what they can do is if you conflict too much with what they already know and you don't take that into consideration, they'll reject that learning, right? They simply just won't do it when they leave the room. They will no longer pay attention. You're not taking their experiences into consideration. I love, Jim, when you said, I reach out to who's the microbiologist in the group that can answer that. I think that's a great example of encouraging, I'll even say sometimes when I create an exercise with a scenario, I'll have a scenario in my back pocket. But I actually was at a company one time and I said, do you have any big projects that are going on right now? And they said, yeah, we're expanding this particular area. I said, do we have time to go down and take a look at that area? And let's do an exercise using that scenario. And they loved it. They totally went from sort of falling asleep in the class to kind of engaging in the class.
Well, it's so much more relevant to them in that space and time, right? So that makes all the difference, I think.
Yes, I encourage during classes, whatever I'm teaching, that we're actually also doing work during that time. So you've brought me a problem statement or something that's relevant to whatever that content is, because then the adult learner is getting a 2-for-1. They're learning what they need to do their job, and they're also doing their job. Because as you know, we're always being...
That's much appreciated, I'm sure.
Yeah, because they're like, I just spent 8 hours in this class. Oh my gosh. Well, guess what? You're going to be doing work during that time and learning at the same time. So I think that's a couple of key reasons, but Jim's probably got some others to share as well.
Sure. Jim, you want to add something to add some things to that?
Yeah, I think, building on, sometimes it's called authentic learning. And, you are doing something that has value in the product that you are creating. So, similar to what Lori was saying, when I do procedure writing training, one of the things is they have to write a procedure. And also, they exchange papers in the different groups. So one group writes something, they have another group critique, and then they reverse. So you're getting both the writing of the procedure and then the critical review of that and giving feedback. Same way with doing investigation reports. The best way to do something is to learn something is to actually do it. And take advantage of these opportunities that you had. Lori gave one. I was doing a workshop on contamination control in France. And we were talking about, how water systems could be contaminated. And we took a break for lunch. I brought the group back and I said, okay, let's go outside to where we just were. And I want you to find a source of contamination. And what we saw was that there was a hose that was in this really algae-filled pond, and it was submerged. So if there was a back siphon on that hose, it would have contaminated part of the water system.
Right.
So it's to get people to open their eyes and say, what's wrong with this picture? But that's really one of the hallmarks of an expert, is to be able to look at something and to see what's missing. A lot of us can say, okay, this is what's wrong, or this is what should be done. But the expert really says, you're missing that. It's not there.
So, and that makes sense. And I'm just wondering, so in terms of buy-in from the adult learners, it sounds like it needs to be relevant. They certainly appreciate it if it relates to the current job at hand. But it seems like they would want to have more input into the what's, when's, and how's of their own learning. And so how critical are all those components, do you think, in terms of successful learning, getting them to buy in to, the task at hand, and then moving forward and actually doing the learning? Jim, we'll start with you. I really like, the work that Knowles did, but sometimes I think he's talking about the ideal adult learner. Right.
They're wanting to come in and they're excited about that. I think we've all been in courses where somebody just wants to fall asleep.
Yes.
And, what can you do to engage that person? What sort of activity or what's going to turn them on to that learning? So I think, that's a real challenge that we're trying to do as an instructor, is to make it exciting for you, make it interesting for them. I think instructors have ways, whether you're doing e-learning or leader-led program, of giving people the sense that they have some control. And some of it can be as simple as, okay, we're giving this workshop 4 different times in the next month. Which one do you want to go to? What's going to work best with your schedule? So, at least you're taking down that piece of resistance. Well, I was forced to go on Wednesday. That meant that I couldn't do this or that. So, giving some people some flexibility in that. Another thing that we've seen at some companies is it's like a menu. And you have to have every year 8 hours of GMP training.
Sure.
So what makes most relevant? Do you want to do a section on data integrity? Do you want to do a section on qualification and validation, updates on regulatory issues? So, give people a chance to say, what's of interest to them? And that is a way of, building a little bit more connection with the topics at hand.
Very good. Thanks. Lori, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I would just add one more thing with what Jim just said. I totally agree with all of those. Probably also allowing them time in the day to walk away from that training and maybe do something else that they need to take care of. So one thing I never shortchange on is breaks, because if you ever want to have a turn of events where 30 people want to murder you, it's not giving them adequate breaks. And I always also tell them up front when those breaks will be, even if that means I, as an instructor, have to quickly readjust my agenda and things around, because I make that commitment to them. But my agreement back at them is, please commit to me, though, that you will come back to class on time. You'll take care, because I know you're busy, but let's also respect each other's time too. And I think that mutual agreement, and as long as I hold my end up, I think helps that learner as well commit to the time then and be present.
So important to take a deep breath, come back a little refreshed, and they can also plan. I mean, because like you both mentioned, they're very busy. They've got a lot jammed into their day. And at least they can plan ahead for when they're going to complete certain must-do tasks, or, check in with the babysitter, God forbid. You don't know, right? People have these things in their daily schedules that need to still happen. So that is such a great point, Lori, that you made. And of course, we're talking about learning. We've been talking about learning so far for the adult learner, kind of in general, in terms of how they learn, what they learn, why, the different catalysts behind it. But to bring it a little bit more into the life science industries, which both of you work in the life science, in life science, effective training that sufficiently qualifies an employee to adequately perform their role. I mean, that's very important. It's essential to delivering a quality product and ensuring patient safety, which really, at the end of the day, in life science, that is the most important piece. So, Lori, I know you've done some research on GMP training for adult learners. What did you find in terms of an organization's ability to build quality training programs?
Yeah, so I'll say it this way. It's sort of across the board. I saw a lot of different things. And I don't think any given place I've been to has the exact same program as any other.
Sure.
I've seen some very mature programs where it's an extensive learning development group of people who have backgrounds in adult learning theory, who have a lot of tools at their disposal to make videos and all kinds of great advanced types of training. I've seen also literal programs that are completely read and understand, right? With the caveat that if it's a manufacturing operator or a laboratory analyst, there's probably some sort of learning on the job kind of hands-on sort of training that accompanies that read and understand, right? So, and then everything sort of in between that. But I think one thing I'll say to the entire industry, though, that I think Jim and I can both agree on is there's still a fair amount of, 483s, EMA observations, things that tie us back again to the challenge of us having an effective training program. For whatever reason, that still across the board kind of eludes us and really being effective and having things stick. And I think the agency's responses of retraining is not adequate is really a good comment to make, because if someone did something inappropriately because they weren't trained well, then retraining them on that same activity is probably not going to change that outcome, right? And
especially if you're training them in the same way, right?
Right, with the same people and the same materials and content. And so,
right.
And that's something I think Jim and I were seeing, right, in the industry again and again. But again, I also see very mature, very well thought out training programs, and then sometimes across the board, very different. Depends on the maturity of the company as well. But I'll say one thing I do see typically, and Jim, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too, is I tend to see that training program as sort of the last piece that's created, right? We're building a facility or we're building a company, and there's all this rush to, maybe even get something approved or licensed or what have you. And then, there's training. And that's sort of that last kind of component that we see. And we tend to train to compliance or train to regulations. We're not always necessarily gearing that training towards how are we really going to get something to stick and someone to really be able to do this and show me that they're capable and measure the effectiveness of that. So,
yeah, and it seems like you're not training them to be problem solvers, right? You're just training them on,
yeah. We could have a whole other podcast on critical thinking. We'll save that for another topic.
Absolutely. Thank you, Laura. And Jim, so I know you have, a lot of experience in this area as well. You've done research like Lori, but you've also been working in the training industry, dealing with learning for adults and training models, et cetera. Can you speak to some of the biggest challenges you've noted in providing meaningful training? And maybe you echo some of Lori's too. I don't know. Yeah.
I think one of the things is that training has to be part of the job. So many organizations say, and you have to do this training, and it's sort of like isolated, but it's not really built in to the fabric of the organization. That learning and training is just as important as, gowning, doing aseptic filling, whatever you have there. I think the other piece, and you mentioned it, Stacey, about adequately trained. You need to really define as an organization, what does that mean for that particular job? And, if you read through the GMPs, it says education, training, experience to enable that person to perform. So if you always focus on performance, you're going to be safe. You're going to meet that regulatory requirement, and also you're going to meet that business need. So, one of the things, if I'm talking to a group, what do you want this training to do? I'll always ask, what is the business need that you have? Why are you doing this? Why are you saying that this is important? And then the second question is, what do you want the person to do differently at the end of this learning event? And that's where competency-based training is really, I think, valuable. You're defining, okay, what do you need to be able to do, and how are you going to demonstrate this to that mentor, to that supervisor, to that trainer, to give them confidence that you can really do this. So I think, thinking about the end in mind as you are starting this path, what do you want that person to do? What does it look like? You just can't be in the head like, I need somebody to understand the GMPs.
Yeah.
But really, what does it mean in that particular job?
And I think that makes so much sense to me. And it sounds, but I don't know if training managers or quality departments are actually doing this. They're thinking through this process, even though it sounds like so, it just sounds like so obvious. But I'll let you speak to that a little bit more. But you've both mentioned the whole regulatory piece, like teaching to the regulations or training to the regulations. And of course, in life sciences, it is a highly regulated industry, and every organization must consider the expectations of the regulators coming in and being compliant at all times. And I'm hoping you can both elaborate a little bit more on what impact this has, like knowing that you have to be compliant and that you're really beholden to those regulators when they come in terms of performance. What impact does that have on the training that's developed for folks in these particular roles? Lori, do you want to kick us off with that?
Sure. I think it goes exactly to what Jim just, sorry to copy you, Jim, but I think it's exactly what Jim just said earlier, which is we tend to sort of check that we meet that foundation or that basic requirement with that regulator because that's what we gear the training towards. Okay, so let's just make this up. We got this observation. They said this and this training is necessary. So we go and we build the agenda around that observation, right? That's our response. We don't step back and say, to Jim's question, what are we really trying to get the learner to do differently? What do we want to change? Or what are they supposed to do when they come out of this? It's more, well, they just told us we don't have enough contamination awareness, right? We better go teach the people this, without really understanding what we're trying to change or what we want that adult learner to do differently coming out of the game. So I think those regulations sort of hinder us a little bit at times. Not that they're not good or not that there's not a reason that they're there, but from a creativity perspective in training, it holds us back a little bit because we're so worried about meeting that requirement. We're so worried that of course we don't want to do anything wrong. We never want to hurt the patient. And we certainly don't want to get regulators upset at us and doing the wrong thing, that it stops us from really asking those questions of, how's this going to improve our business? Because it probably will, right? How's this going to improve our learner? It probably will. We're sort of blocking ourselves from thinking that through, and we don't allow ourselves to then think of the creative material and the concepts and things that we can come out with to do that more effectively.
Yeah, I mean, it almost sounds like you're saying that oftentimes the training is reactive in a way because, you get a certain response from the regulator, whether it comes in the form of a warning, a 483, or whether it's a comment that they make on site. But it seems like it could easily become a reactive type of training or retraining. Jim, I'm going to let you continue to elaborate on that topic.
Yeah, I think it really does need to be proactive. And, focusing again on that word perform. If you can get someone to perform that assigned task of doing a filter integrity test, preparing a sample, running HPLC, whatever it is, you're 90% there. The FDA GMPs are a performance standard. They said, this is the outcome that we want you to achieve. We'll give you some flexibility. It's different from, like OSHA standards, where it's very, very prescribed. FAA standards, very, very prescribed for training of flight attendants, for example. So we do have this flexibility. So I think if you can get that person to perform and you can demonstrate that, then there are really only a few other things that you need to do to be able to satisfy the regulator. Have some sort of documentation of that training. Have the training approved by your quality unit. Have that outlined with objectives and the topics that are covered. Have that available to show the inspector if he or she wants to see that. So I think, if you focus on the performance, you're going to be miles ahead. And it's just some of these other few things that you need to do to really make it compliant.
Mm-hmm.
Understood. And in follow up to that, Jim, keeping performance in mind as sort of the end goal, right? You're trying to improve performance, which hopefully will improve the outcomes here. What tools or protocols are there for exist currently, or for organizations to better identify the unique learning styles of the adult learners or the employees that they have, and balance that with the job that they need to do and the resources that the organization has available?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a multi-dimensional question that you asked there.
I guess so. It's multi-dimensional, right? In the sense that the organization has to consider all of these things. Like, I've got this group of adults. What do they need from me in terms of learning? I've got these job requirements that must be met, of course. And then I have X for resources, whatever that is, and that will vary by company. But what tools or protocols are there out there to help guide training managers or quality departments through this process?
Yeah, it's a couple things. One, you mentioned learning styles, and there's been really different types of research to show, is a learning style really influential or partially influential? And it tends to be more of a preference. I tend to like information presented to me by reading, but I can get it from other ways as well. It might take me a little bit more work to do it, but yet I can get that information. So I think that's one piece of that. The other thing is learners go into a training session, and trainers have this expression called "with them." Yeah. What's in it for me?
Yes.
What am I going to get out of this? How is this training going to make my life easier? How is it going to, save me time? How is it going to save me anxiety when I am doing this task? So I think that is a key thing. What's in it for me? And if you can put yourself in the learner's shoes as you're trying to come up with that solution, and it's not sink or swim. You're not throwing somebody into the deep end of the pool and just see what happens.
Right.
But you're doing it in a more structured way and giving them feedback, giving them mentoring, coaching as they're going through that. And, that means that if somebody comes in with the experience and they've, done aseptic filling or they've done filter protocols before, they're going to do it pretty fast. They're going to get through that training pretty quickly. But if it's somebody like me, I've not really done that before,
right,
it's going to take me a little bit longer, but I'm going to have somebody coaching me and helping me through that. So to think about, what's in it for me, putting yourself in the shoes of that learner, and then having some support, having that more knowledgeable other, that mentor, that coach that helps guide me to be successful.
Right. So, and it ties in to what you said earlier about really on the job. So this is another way of providing on the job training, right? Is having that coach or that mentor there that can model the expected behaviors, whether it's the processes or the protocols or whatever, flipping the switch, running the machine. You name it, right? So, with that in mind, and the what's in it for me thought in the back of the learner, knowing that that's sort of there, and you both earlier spoke about how adult learners come with the knowledge they've acquired over a lifetime of what they, of work and schooling. And they have their own opinions and they have their own practices, whether they're good, bad, or indifferent. What does it take then to get them to shift? So the learners, to get them to start to shift in thought from, their preconceived notions, their things that they already know, the way they already do things, to move them from that space to really accepting the new information and the processes. And I'll let you continue, Jim, and then Lori will come bounce back to you.
I think there are a lot of different motivators that we have when we go into training. Yeah, certainly it's what's in it for me. But, one motivation is fear. If I do this wrong, what does it mean to my job? Am I going to get written up for that? What does it mean to the patient? So some people will think about it, if I don't do this right, this is what can happen, so I better learn to do it. Other times people are thinking more altruistically. And that means, hey, I'm making this product for that patient. I have that person in mind. Maybe they visited our firm and I've met a person that is actually taking our product. Maybe it's a family member that's taking a product. So I want to do the best I possibly can for them. For other people, it's really more of that challenge. And how can I perfect my skills at this over and over? Sometimes you'll see this in analytical chemists. I think that's one of the best models. For example, there's a hospital up in Toronto, and they only do one type of surgery. They only do hernia repair. That's the only thing that they do. And these doctors do it day after day after day, but they do it because they're perfecting their craft at that. So you have to sort of think about, okay, what's going to motivate this person? Do we tell them a horror story at the beginning? Do we introduce them to some patients that are doing that? So it's really trying to figure out what's the button that I can push as the instructor that's going to get this person excited and see the value in learning this content.
That doesn't seem like that would be that easy to do, always in every situation. Lori, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've had some students that kind of fight me a little bit, meaning that not they're physically fighting me, but they're fighting me and kind of embracing some of those learnings, because they're like, but at my last company or at the place I worked at, or I was in charge of this at one time. So what you have to, those are the extreme examples, but I'm just giving them as one, just to include what Jim was saying.
And that can happen, absolutely.
Yeah, is that you include, okay, well, tell me what you learned at your last company. And then as an instructor and also as an expert in, for example, I do risk management training a lot. I'll try to think, how can I merge what this person did do in the past with what we're trying to do so that they're heard and their expertise is part of that, but they also kind of walk along that path with me to get to this place where I've been hired to, deliver this training and what they want. So I think kind of including that learning, and I'll even sometimes talk to them at the break and I'll say, hey, would you mind teaching a little part of this class? Here's what I'm thinking, because typically these people do see themselves as an expert, and they're right, they are. And so including them in some of the teach backs, having them lead, like I'll actually say to them, oh, you've facilitated before. Hey, why don't you lead this little sub team over here? And and they'll give you some feedback. And then they start to actually kind of make that transition, that change, as they realize they're in a little bit in control of the driver's seat of this exercise that we're doing. So I kind of include typically a little bit of change management expertise in my training sometimes to help them make that leap a little bit.
Hey, you've got to use all the tools you have in your bag, Lori.
Yeah.
One other thing that made me think from what Lori was saying, another thing is to let them see themselves what they don't know. So giving them sort of a pre-test, and nobody who sees that, but talk about some of the things that you're going to be covering in that workshop that might be changes in the regulation or changes in philosophy, and get them to say, ooh, I guess I got that wrong. I got to listen to that. So that can also help prime someone to be a little bit more focused on some of those topics.
Yeah. I totally love that, actually, Jim. That's great.
Yeah, that's a great. So it sounds like, just in listening to the two of you talk about this whole process and being more proactive, not reactive, and really just getting the team sort of buy-in from the beginning that they're going to be continuously learning, and that this is something that just needs to be part of what you do as an organization. And so it seems almost like you need to build that culture as a life science company. And what is your experience? I'm asking this to both of you. What's your experience with this whole sort of concept of building a culture? Are companies developing training programs, or are they developing learning cultures? And why is this an important distinction, do you think, if you think so?
Do you want me to jump in on that, Jim?
Sure, go ahead.
We're both very passionate, I think, about learning cultures. And so what I typically do see, to your point, Stacey, is I see a lot of training programs, but I don't see a lot of learning culture. And I think Jim probably has a much better definition than I do, but a learning culture I typically see as the employee is craving to attend more and get more information. They're encouraged to grow in their development, even on their own, seeking it outside of the company. They're encouraged to seek maybe secondary degrees, things like that. Those are sort of the pieces I think that are part of what comprises a learning culture. And I think it's driven from the top down. It's encouraged by senior leadership and celebrated when you do these things.
Like all cultures.
Yeah.
It has to be present.
It does have to come from the top, doesn't it? To be successful. And whereas with training programs, it's reinforced more. Go take that training by this day because we need to meet the metric.
Yeah.
Right. So that's a training program that's even probably less than sufficient, right, or adequate. And so I think to encourage that learning program, we need to develop those learners that are excited and enticed. And in the defense of companies that may not have that learning culture, it may have come from the fact that they may have had several training sessions that weren't very effective. And so the learner didn't feel like it was valued time. Didn't change anything for them. It wasn't positive for their job. So they didn't necessarily seek that out again in the future. So they almost killed that learning culture by sort of killing them with bad training, right? If that makes sense.
Right.
So that's kind of what I see, but I'll let Jim run with that too.
Yeah, I think the change is really a change in philosophy and a change in dynamics. Because if you have a training culture, I'm the trainer, I'm pushing this on you. So it's really a push onto the person. When you're talking about a learning culture, it changes that to more of a pull culture. You as a trainer now, you are a facilitator, you are the provider of content that can be pulled when these people need to use it. Right. I think another part of that idea of the culture is the learning organization and having opportunities for learning. Having management that supports that type of endeavor. There's also some work by a woman by the name of Amy Edmondson. She's at Harvard, and she talks about psychological safety as really important to the organization. And psychological safety allows me to ask that dumb question and not feel stupid about it.
Right.
Or to raise my hand and say, hey, I just really messed up. I did this and I shouldn't have done that. We just lost, $20,000 worth of raw material there. And to be able to come up and say that without getting your head slapped for that. So I think, that is important. What some companies have done is move to what we call after action reviews that really developed in the military. And you're asking 4 questions. What is supposed to have happened? What actually did happen? What is the delta? What is the difference between what should have happened and what did happen? And then the final question is, what do we want to do differently, or what do we want to continue to do to have that success? So, you don't do it just when things go bad, but a learning culture, a learning organization will ask that set of 4 questions after almost anything of significance. And, that's a way of, bringing in learning. What did we learn this week? What is going to make our jobs easier to do, better success next week when we do that same task?
I think that's so important. I mean, you hear about companies, stepping outside of the life sciences industry for a moment, but a company like Google, let's say, where we continuously hear that their engineers are actually encouraged to fail, like break something, mess it up. Because we want as an organization to learn from that and provide the opportunity for everyone to walk away with some new information or improved process. And it sounds a lot
just like... And one other thing about that, Stacey, is you want to be able to fail safe.
Right.
Yeah.
You don't want to be able to fail, on $1 million worth of vaccine that is going out.
Well,
you want to have that safe environment.
To fail, and you also have to be, your organization, it sounds like, has to be set up so that, yes, it isn't impacting, a patient product, you're doing that more, I would think, in the research and development phase, or in the, where it's safe to brainstorm new ideas, new concepts, and it's still okay to make a mistake or not get it right the first time.
Yep.
Definitely can't do that in clinical trials.
No, and I think lessons learned too, to add to Jim's, are things that I don't typically see a ton of at times.
Right.
But when I'm at a place that does do it, it's important to be able to take those lessons learned and turn them back into something that's actionable, and that creates that culture, right? Okay, something happened. How do we either make that better next time, or avoid that, or minimize the effect of that? That's a learning culture, right? I think that's a great example.
Absolutely. And I have a follow-up question for the two of you that's very timely, because right now we've seen so many organizations have to transition to online learning, virtual, remote work is being done everywhere as this pandemic drags on. And in your experience, how effective are online webinars and remote learning sessions that people are doing now, during this time, compared to face-to-face instructor courses that, we might have seen in the past?
Mm-hmm. From my experience, it depends on the design of the course.
Okay.
If you have a 2-hour webinar and it's just PowerPoint slide after PowerPoint slide, you as the participant, as the observer of that, you're going to be doing other stuff. I'm going to be checking my email. I'm going to be, doing this or that. Yeah, we all do that. But if you design a course, and I'm working now really designing one up that's really optimized for this type of distance learning, where you're continually building in activities. You have people that are working together. There are little projects that people are doing. They can go into a little chat room, or if they're at the same company, they can, talk offline and create something.
Sure.
So I think that's important. And I think you have to really look at what is anybody capable of absorbing. I've seen some distance learning webinars that go for 8 hours. Slit my wrists now.
Yeah, right. No.
What do you really expect to accomplish in that? So I think you have to really think about the learner again and have a design that is optimized for that type of delivery. You just can't give them PowerPoint slides.
Sure.
What do you think? What do you think there, Lori?
I totally agree. In fact, I've had to create training just recently, start to think about that at the new company I'm at, and really think about what is absorbable, if you will, in that time frame. And I'm kind of going of the mindset too, Jim, of almost like bite-size sort of trainings, or maybe they're only 15, 20 minutes long, and there's some engagement, of course, and then maybe we go away and we follow up with another one, maybe a day later. I mean, one thing to be careful about too with learning is you only retain it for so long if you don't use it.
Right.
So I'm kind of going down this process in my mind of what I refer to as just in time. It's something I need because I'm going to go execute something within that day or that week, right? And it's bite size and I can manage it. Another thing that's interesting is I've read a study recently. I think we have something of the attention now of a goldfish, I think it said, which is about 10 to 15 seconds because things are so instantaneous. Like while I've even been on this call with you, I can see out of the left corner of my eye that my phone is probably binging, news, right, constantly. And so because we have all this in our face, it's very difficult to capture people's attention for very long. So I totally agree with what Jim said. I've also recently started doing things where I record the WebEx, and I actually have people use the comments, the chats, to respond to things to me, because some people don't like to talk on the phone.
Right.
I'm not always getting engagement. I ask a question and there's sort of crickets if that existed on the phone. So now I'm getting people to write their comments, and then I'm commenting on those. I'm like, oh, well, so-and-so, because your name is next to your comment. Tell me more about that, right? Give me an example of where you've seen that, or how did you use that? And so I'm getting some sort of dialogue from that and interaction. I love the breakout rooms, like Jim said. I learned about that because of my kids doing distance learning.
Right.
And the Zoom has breakout rooms. Other ones have it too.
Mm-hmm.
So those are things I think we need to think about. But yeah, gone are the days for the moment of 8-hour, long trainings. I'm currently trying to think through how would I coach a facilitator of risk assessments or a facilitator of meetings. How am I going to, I typically do that, have some extensive workshops and there's Post-its and flip charts, and how do I change that mindset? So that mindset of mine, how do I think through that? But I think webinars can be very effective if they're done right. And it depends on the topic, to Jim's point, but I think they can be really well done too.
And I thank you both for sharing some strategies. I mean, I think that's very important for people to keep in mind, and it's only getting more relevant as we, continue to need online training and just online support in general. And so in your experience, and again, I give you both an opportunity to answer this. In your experience, what's the best way to measure effectiveness in terms of achieving the goals that you set out for the training? Can you and maybe if you can each share an example or two of some effective training programs that you've been involved in and what the outcomes kind of look like on that. Jim, you want to
go first, Lori?
Okay.
Lori? Okay.
I'll give an example. One is, I'll start out by saying this, Stacey. This is a really tough question, and I think it's something we all grapple with as trainers too, of how do we truly measure that effectiveness? And even our American culture is moving away from standardized testing and such. So how do we really get a handle on that? Well, one Jim already mentioned earlier, which is measuring someone's understanding and knowledge before they go through the session, and then measuring that again at the end with sort of a survey kind of based questionnaire. I think that's
kind of a typical, right?
Yeah.
That's a typical measurement.
Yep. Yeah, it kind of tells us. The other one that I've done in recent years is I've actually, at the end of a long training session, this went on for many days, I actually had the student teach back a component of that week to me as the instructor. Now, there's a couple of challenges with that. One, I'm one person and my classes were sometimes 30 people.
Right.
So I qualified others to do that with me. But I will tell you that nothing tells me more about you than if you can teach back something I taught to you. Because when you teach something back, you really, truly have to understand it to explain it to me, right? Now, that's a little bit of a gray area in terms of how I graded that, but I had criteria. I had a rubric that we used. And I even told the student up front what I was looking for in this presentation, understanding of the content, and that we would work with them throughout the week to help them build that, but it was on their own that they had to build it for me, right? And they had to use a real project and a real example. That was a really cool opportunity for me to be able to measure effectiveness over time.
You did that 32 times? I mean,
yeah.
Wow.
I had other people qualified, so I qualified others to do it with me. So we were consistent. We would always talk about how we did it. So there's a little bit of, I know there's a little ambiguity there in terms of, how you're going to grade that. But that was really a great opportunity. Longer term company-wide metrics is a bit of a different story. We're always struggling with that. We tend to want to measure it on repeat deviations or investigations around a process that we trained people on. Is our issues still recurring? Right. Those are opportunities as well. And then I'm going to pass it to Jim too, because this is a really tough question, no doubt.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's one
going back to what
an organization wants to know. If they're for you to come in and train, they're going to be like, how are you going to know? Yeah.
Yes, for sure. How much do you cost, and is it worth it?
Exactly.
Right? Yeah. So I think it's going back to that word perform. And as Lori said, okay, someone is teaching back that they're facilitating a risk assessment and I'm watching them do that. I can give them some coaching and say, yeah, this was really strong. Next time you do this, consider this. Maybe you can make an improvement in that area. So thinking about performance, thinking about, okay, can I actually write a procedure? And is it going to get through that process? So it's one of the things that can give you a lot of confidence is if that assessment method closely matches how somebody does that in their job, you're going to have more confidence of that transfer to that job. So the more closely you can create those opportunities for people to do something in that safe environment, whether it's gowning, whether it's doing simulations of aseptic processing in a particular environment, that you're handling things properly. You're not breaking the first air as it's coming down and getting potential contamination. But that's why it's that you should start that at the very beginning. What is success for this learner? What does it look like? And then how am I going to help that person achieve that success by the end of the learning solution?
Because that seems like those are the metrics that really matter to the organization, right? In terms of training and learning, in the end, like what are they gonna bring back to me as the leader of the organization, to their job? And I guess ultimately, it sounds like you're saying, how does it impact their performance?
Yep. I love the gowning example, Jim, because I think one metric that's really a good one to measure is how many times you've trained them to gown, you've trained them to perform this sterile operation, but how many times are they coming up hot when they're doing their FIP testing, right? They're plating themselves and that's a good indicator of, training maybe failed or was really successful. Those are ones that are pretty easy to grab onto as well, and that tie directly back to the business too.
Right. And And I love the examples. I think that helps us all. So we've talked a lot about formal training programs, and of course you can put a lot of thought and effort into those up front, and you should, not can, but should. But are there ways that we can use more informal training, other than scheduled and required courses or an online seminar? And how can we use those within the organization?
I think part of it is giving people the chance to reflect. And the example that I used earlier about after-action reviews, learning from an experience. To get some, people to think about, what did we learn this week? And having a supervisor, having colleagues, having a community of practice, a group of people saying, okay, we've been doing these investigations. What have we been learning? What things do we want to perpetuate? What things do we want to change? What more support can we give people? Because, it's not just the training. There are other pieces that really have to come together to support that performance. Do they have the chance to practice? Are they giving feedback? Do they have the knowledge and skills that they need? Is there organization support that encourages them from a supervisor or a mentor? So I think, looking at that whole picture, that gestalt of things that you really need to have in place to support that learning. Some of it can be formal, as we've been talking about, but also that informal. What have I learned? What am I going to do different? And to somehow encourage people and get them to see the value in that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That is so important. Really, to have that that understand inside, like the value that this is having, and really to feel, I guess, successful in what you're trying to do and what you've been trying to learn. Right. You sort of, Lori, I know you might have something to add here. Yeah,
and I feel like lately I have pandemic brain, so I had to take a few notes there when Jim was talking. So I think one thing I would just add to everything that Jim already said, which was all good stuff, is community of practice is always something I like to do, where you just have an opportunity. Maybe it's 1 hour where you bring people together and kind of share an example of a project you worked on or something that reinforces something you've been sort of training the organization on. Those are voluntary typically, but people kind of like them because they're sort of free flowing. You get to ask questions. It's not formal and I'm not going to get tested on it. I like those. I like brown bag sessions when we were all in the office. We would have lunch together and, share an idea or discuss a topic. I think one thing that I train a lot of people on is facilitation, and that's one you can always share best practices on, and it's something that people like to hear more about and go, oh, I'm going to start doing that, or here's a little tool on how I keep notes or something. Those are things, I think, just a couple things to add to what Jim said that are informal, but they're still training. I mean, my goodness, you can even watch a 10-minute video that's, on the internet. I recommend sometimes YouTube videos. Like I found one recently on risk culture. I thought it was fantastic. It was 8 minutes.
Nice.
I had one of my teams watch it, and we had some conversations about it the next day. That's a good training as well. It's very informal.
And to Jim's earlier point, those are all safe ways to learn. There's safe ways to exchange information and maybe, grow and evolve in terms of what you're doing as a group. So I think that's very important.
Could I just add one more thing to that? You want to have situations where people can have fun, to have some level of humor and, watching a cat video or something, just to sort of break that concentration. So if people laugh, if they have fun, it sort of opens up another part of their brain.
Of course.
And it really makes it much more enjoyable for everybody. So, to use humor appropriately, to get people to have fun and enjoy the learning process. I think that's all important.
Excellent. Well, Jim and Lori, we have learned so much today about the whole ins and outs, I guess, of training, corporate training programs, and in particular here in a regulated industry. And definitely my takeaway is that it is not easy to develop good training and to deliver good training, nor does it sound like it's easy to assess the learning that's gone on. So I applaud the two of you for having done it so long in the industry and been successful at it. Before we close, I just want to give you a last moment to share a thought or a tip or some sort of strategy or a parting, whatever thought with our listeners. And Lori, we'll let you do that first.
Yeah, I think, and it's been a common thread, I think, between Jim and I today is that coaching and mentoring, I think, is something that is vastly overlooked. I see in a lot of programs, we tend to want to sort of drop this bomb of knowledge in a classroom setting and then send people on their way to go do it, make it happen. And I think coaching and mentoring and follow up after that training and reinforcement and asking questions and watching them do the activity and assessing that, I think is a critical component that I typically see kind of overlooked by companies. It takes resources, time, and money. And I think it's not necessarily viewed as being necessary.
Right. Jim?
Two things. I think you have to look at training and learning programs as an investment. And you invest in equipment, you invest in facilities and all this. You have to invest in people. The other statement comes from Alan Kay. And Alan was the inventor of the personal computer when he was at Xerox Palo Alto Research Center. He's now moved into education. And I was at a meeting when he was speaking, and he says, memorizing is easy, learning is hard. And it is hard work, some of the things that we've talked about. But, think about the benefits that you're going to have of that. It's this idea that learning is an investment for the organization and for that person.
Absolutely.
Love that.
Absolutely. I'm going to leave it right there, Jim, because I think that's a great ending statement. But I want to thank you, Lori and Jim, for being with us today. It's been a pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
Thanks. It's been fun.
Yes.
Absolutely. Thanks also. I want to send another thanks out to Ben Kitchen, our producer, and the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. And lastly, a big thank you to you, our valued listeners. If you have topic requests or guest suggestions, we'd love to hear from you on that. If you enjoyed this episode, we ask you to subscribe in your podcast player of choice and share it with your friends, colleagues, and your online networks, of course. For today's show notes and information on this podcast, please visit www.ivtnetwork.com. We'll be back again next week with another great interview. Until then, stay healthy and safe.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.